Everybody clap your hands. Freeze! Everybody clap your hands.
And what happened?
4 signs of mental illness and how people react. A front-facing, tight-out smiley face, I call it the pickpocket smile. It's very jarring and intimate. It's a manipulation tactic so that you let your guard down. Back-facing, tight-out smiley face, I call it the Joker smiley face.
In this era of technology, social media has become a central part of many people's lives. Some of the positive effects include better communication, being able to spread awareness for a cause to a larger audience, and being able to find people with similar interests better. However, with all the positive effects in mind, you have to also bring attention to the negative effects of social media, like FOMO, cyberbullying, and most notably, the negative impact it has on its users, especially the mental health of its youth. While social media has created a space that allows for people with mental illness to speak about their experiences, the destigmatization of mental illnesses have also caused another problem to rise: the romanticization of mental illness. This means that people see mental illness as beautiful or desirable. There's been a rising trend over the years where people treat mental illness as an accessory and not something that has ruined the lives of millions. The main question that I'll be looking to answer is, how does social media depict mental illness in a way that causes people to romanticize it? I hypothesize that if mental illness is presented as relatable on social media, then people will romanticize it. The less relatable a mental illness is, then people will romanticize it less. So, the target audience for my survey was people ages 14 to 25. And because this is usually who is affected by the romanticization of mental illness the most, like young teens and young adults. And despite the target audience, the 14 participants of my survey were all in grade 11. Well, not all in grade 11, but a majority of them were in grade 11, and only 3 of them were in grade 12. Okay, so this first graph shows the particular mental disorders that my participants have seen been represented positively on social media. This was an open-ended question, but there were 2 mental disorders that kept coming out: anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, this second graph that is about to flash on the screen represents the mental disorders that participants have seen been represented negatively or badly. And the answers really varied on this one, but the certain disorders that stuck out to me were bipolar disorder and personality disorders like borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. So for this next graph, participants were asked to rate how often they watch TV shows or films that cover topics of mental illness and mental disorders. Most had expressed that they had seen mental illness covered on TV, and when asked how accurate their depiction of it was, most answered that it was pretty accurate and it covered the full spectrum of what mentally ill people go through. However, there were a few people who had answered that the performances were stereotypical and not at all accurate. So this next graph shows the results of certain yes or no questions. The first question is, have you ever believed you had a mental illness because of social media? And 10 students said yes to this. The next question was, have you jokingly claimed you had a mental illness? Like said something along the lines of, not everything's organized, my OCD is coming out. And responses were more mixed. 8 people answered yes, while 6 people answered no. The final question was, are you neurotypical and yearn in some way to be neurodivergent, which is a more direct kind of question. A majority of people said no, but there were still 4 that had said yes. The next question I asked was related to the last, and asked how much research was put in to confirm their suspicions if they had answered yes on the last question. Participants said that it ranged from a minimum to very extensive research. they checked articles, they read websites, they read other people's experiences with a mental illness, and so on. While it's good that research was done, it also says something about the content on social media. It makes people worry about disorders they may not have. They may have, but who knows? Depends on the person. Self-diagnosing isn't a crime, especially since not everyone lives in a place where healthcare is free, and as long as research is done, it's fine. Self-diagnosis is fine. Now, this final graph rates how acceptable or unacceptable these common symptoms of many mental illnesses are. The list of behaviors went from most to least acceptable, and the list goes, so the most acceptable is increased sleep, being pessimistic, being withdrawn from relationships, having emotional outbursts from little things, and finally, the least acceptable, having low hygiene. So, what does all of this add up to? To remind you guys, the main question I want to answer is, how does social media depict mental illness in a way that causes people to romanticize it? The most positively represented mental illnesses are depression and anxiety. And it's pretty easy to see why. So why are they represented more positively? Because they can be dumbed down with simpler, more relatable traits. The symptoms of depression include feelings of sadness, angry outbursts, sleep disturbances, frequent thoughts of death, and cognitive issues. The symptoms of anxiety and other anxiety-related disorders include having an irrational sense of impending danger, increased heart rate, and having difficulty controlling worry. I think I can speak for most of the population of the earth when I say that we've all felt depressed or anxious. They're very common feelings. We feel depressed when something bad happens to us, like a loved one passed away. And we feel anxious when we, say, present something or we go through a job interview. When these feelings of depression and anxiety prolong throughout our life and it feels more like a constant, then it becomes a problem. Otherwise, feeling depressed or anxious does not equate to having depression or anxiety. Those are mental disorders, and they're separate from the feelings of being depressed and being anxious. By just dumbing it down to its simplest symptoms, it makes the disorders seem more relatable than they actually are. When neurotypicals see the less acceptable symptoms of mental illness, more than half the time the support they show for the mentally ill people online usually is thrown out the window, and they begin to belittle them for not taking care of themselves, which is kind of odd given the circumstances. But one of the other questions I asked on the survey was to rate how acceptable common behaviors of mental illness was, and the least acceptable was having low hygiene, so not showering and cleaning yourself. It's seen as gross by most of society, and it kind of is. You're gonna stink after a while, but it's ignored so much more often for more acceptable and easier to swallow symptoms and behaviors seen in mentally ill people, despite being just as severe. Seeing the mental disorders that are represented more negatively supports this. With disorders like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder, and schizophrenia, it's hard to make these disorders more relatable since their symptoms are less desirable, and they're still pretty heavily stigmatized. Not many people go around proudly saying they hallucinate or they have delusions of grandeur, at least not with other people shaming them. Although bipolar disorder is somewhat an exception, because you'll see people who dumb the manic episodes and the depressive episodes into like, oh, mood swings, oh, I'm so bipolar, ha ha ha, because I'm so moody. You'll still find shame from like regarding people as bipolar. Like, you don't proudly label yourself as bipolar. It's always as a joke, and that further supports, oh, it's not a trend, it's not desirable as, say, depression or anxiety. So basically, to put that all together, mental illness may be romanticized on social media because the disorders have been dumbed down to be relatable. So less relatable disorders aren't as romanticized. While that proved my initial hypothesis, I also found that there were other reasons to why mental illness is romanticized as well. Another reason is because people want love and support from others. There is a similar mental illness called, I believe it's called Munchausen syndrome. I could be pronouncing it wrong. And it basically involves people faking an illness, although usually it's a physical illness and not mental. They usually do this to gather support and attention from the people they love, or just other people in general. And for people who romanticize mental illness, it's for the same reason. Like, for example, does anyone remember the YouTuber Jada Animations, who shared her experiences with eating disorders in 2017? I think it was 6 years ago. Anyways, in her comment section there are hundreds and thousands, maybe even millions, probably thousands though, of people just giving her so much support and love and being like so understanding and sharing their own experiences of eating disorders. And see, a person who has low self-esteem, or just lonely, or just plain jealous, may see all of this love and want that same attention and sympathy from others, because they might not be getting that from, say, their home life. So they romanticize mental illness, they want it, and sometimes they even pretend to have it on social media to get that same love and support, to fill that empty void inside of themselves because they don't receive it at home or something. So the last reason I want to talk about isn't really about social media. It technically is, but it's more about the media we consume and not social media. Because TV and film are things we discuss on social media, of course, so we need to discuss it as well. TV and movies are both art forms that discuss mental illness in some way, in some shape or way. However, not all depictions of mental illness are good ones. For example, 13 Reasons Why. It basically, if you don't know the show, I feel like we should have all known about the show, but if you don't know, is about how this high schooler, Hannah Baker, she killed herself and she left tapes describing the reasons why she killed herself, and she basically puts the blame on others and causes trouble and discord from beyond the grave. This sends a horrible message to any depressed person or anyone like contemplating suicide, because it basically states that suicide is a possible option and it brings power to you even though you're already dead, when really it's not. It really shouldn't have ever been depicted as that, but that was the message they were sending out, especially since suicide rates had gone up in America after the show aired. Another bad depiction of mental illness comes from Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. And I haven't watched the show, but from the clips and from like the very small portions of it, and from what other neurodivergent people have said about the show and the character, is that he's also a very bad depiction, specifically of autism, though autism is not a mental health disorder, but it's the same point still stands. Basically, he has, although it's never like explicitly said that Sheldon has autism, it's very much implied, and plus his other like big personality trait is that he's a super genius. So this basically has convinced hundreds of people that being autistic equates to being a super genius, when it really isn't that at all. It's just completely wrong depiction of autism, and it goes with other mental illnesses as well. To add on to all of this, many mentally ill behaviors have been not only dumbed down, as mentioned before, but also joked about. The most popular phrase I hear on social media nowadays, well, not nowadays, but still, is kill yourself, or I'm gonna kill myself over a small inconvenience. Now, I'm one of those people that use that phrase. I'm guilty. Suicide is not something you should be joking about, and I'm sure many people are well aware of that. And yet, I know that many of my generation, many of my peers say these jokes without much thought to them. maybe there's some truth to them, but there's not much thought that goes into it. It just kind of comes out. And it goes to show how often mental illness is joked about and not taken seriously, and it's basically made like a caricature of itself in the TV we watch and the content we see on social media, which is why so many people romanticize and at least subtly desire mental illness. So the limits to my survey were the small number of participants, the lack of diversity, and the participants themselves who caused problems for me. Now the last one seemed bad, but we'll get to that one. So basically there were only 14 participants, and they were all in either grade 11 or grade 12. And obviously those 14 people don't speak for the millions and millions of teenagers and young adults all over the globe. So it caused results to be severely less reliable than, say, a survey with thousands of responses. And because of this, I had to do a lot of separate research to confirm my suspicions that I got from the survey. So the other problem came up when I was analyzing the results. I noticed that some of the questions didn't have 14 responses. Some of them had 10 or 12 or just less than 14. And I was really wondering why. You knew what you were going into by answering the survey, so why would you skip some questions and make it harder on me? So if you were part of those 14 people who didn't answer every single question, why? Mental illness is still a touchy subject to many people, and while we as a society have come a long way from alienating people with these illnesses, I feel that we may have become too casual with it as well. From the data collected, it can be concluded that people on social media have romanticized mental illness by making it seem more beautiful than it really is, making it seem relatable, and by joking and downplaying the severity of it. While mental illness shouldn't be treated like a horrible, deadly disease, it should also not be treated like it hasn't ruined the lives of millions of people, and it should definitely not be something a person wants.